Oh howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Grinding Gear Games dropped a fairly substantial balance change when they announced that they're going to be removing the Veiled Chaos Orb and also making the Ashling Slam completely itemizable and completely tradable without any of the friction that exists at the moment. Now, this is going to have a big impact on crafting in several slots. One of the things that's been really strong that players have been able to do for a while is apply prefixes can't change or suffixes can't change and then hit the item with a Veiled Chaos Orb. This is extremely strong for crafting middle tier boots, particularly early in Endgame, and that's because 3 of the Veiled mods are excellent Movespeed mods. And that meant that it was very likely you would get at least one of them as an option. In fact, it was almost guaranteed. Now, I do want to say one very important thing. This is pre-patch notes information. It is possible that things will change significantly when the patch notes come out. If they change in a way that totally transforms all of the information in this video, then I will unlist this video. If they change in a way that's smaller, I'll put a note down in the video description and also in a pinned comment outlining any changes that need to be made. So the way that someone that was on a 3 divine budget used to craft endgame boots was usually to start out with a 3 suffix item that came maybe from Rog. Rog's the best spot of it, but there were other places you could get this as well. Rog tends to give you 6 mod items, so you would then surgically remove a prefix through the use of an Eldritch Orb of Annulment after making the item Searing Exarch dominated, and then at that point you would craft suffixes can't change on the item, you then hit it with a Veiled Chaos Orb, and then you'd have a look at your options on the Veiled Chaos Orb, and almost always, something like 85% of the time, you'd get a good movement speed roll. Less commonly the boots would roll 30 or 35% move speed directly, but more often you would get a Veiled mod option that was one of the movement speed mods. So that was how it used to be done to craft boots on a roughly 3 divine budget for endgame play. And they would work until you were able to surpass them. Now I want to outline 6 alternate ways that you can craft endgame boots now that are mostly aimed at that same sort of phase of endgame, when you're looking to spend a couple of divines on your boots. Firstly though, one thing that hasn't changed, and that is what to use in yellow maps. You should pick up a set of 2-tone boots that drop on the ground, you should pick them all up until you can get a reasonable set of them, and you just want to hit these with an Orb of Binding. Orbs of Binding, they're not that common, but they're not rare either, and this is the best use for them, Alking maps being the second best use for them. This will eventually get you something that's serviceable. If you need something like triple red in your boots, then you definitely don't want to use one that has a 0 strength requirement. So do keep that in mind, but there are 3 types of 2-tone boots. You should be able to get the colors you want within a modest number of chromes. The reason you want to use 2-tone boots specifically is that early in progression, you just need to get your resists consolidated on a smaller number of items. When you're going through the axe, you probably have resists on all your gear. You want to try and get that consolidated into a smaller number, and 2-tone boots will help you with that goal. So that's the pre-endgame setup. Now our option 1 is going to seem like a little bit of a cop-out because it is not really a crafting method, but that is just to use a unique. And obviously this is a better option if you're in Trade League than if you're in solo self-found. There's a number of pretty good unique boots though that are things that you should always have on your radar as options, because if you can pick one of these up for 2 chaos, then it's going to be really good. So to go through a few of them, if you're allocating Ghost Dance on your tree especially, then Sintrack is probably going to be better than anything under 100 chaos. And if you're playing a spell suppression and evasion build, then Atziri's Step is probably going to be better than anything under about 300 chaos. So keep these 2 in mind. Then there's a few that are a little bit more specific. The Stampede and Replica Stampede are not common boots, but they are quite good, so they're one to keep in mind. Replica Inya's Epiphany is something that fits only if you're using a lot of power charges on your build, but they are pretty good as well. And then there's things like Kalm's Roots and Skyforth that are a bit rarer, but that will exist in a trade league, and of course do drop for some individuals in a solo self-found environment as well. All of these are worth keeping in mind, but now let's get to real crafting. Firstly, let's ship Rog with Eldritch Monstrosities, because that seems like fun. And actually, this is a really good way to get boots going early on. So Eldritch crafting in Rog used to be done slightly differently. You used to use Divine Orbs and Meta mods. Nowadays, you're going to do it slightly differently, but you can still get a good setup here. I will say that this one is Trade League only, unfortunately. This one is not going to be something that's particularly accessible in solo self-found, but you can usually pick up Eldritch Chaos Orbs, not necessarily cheaply, but they're not staggeringly expensive early on, and on average, you're only going to need about 6 to hit something good. Step 1, you try and make good boots with Rog. If you succeed, fantastic. Most of the time you're going to fail. But if you fail with 3 good suffixes, and this will happen a lot, then what you want to do is apply 1 Lesser Eldritch Ember. The implicit doesn't matter. Now you want to apply Eldritch Chaos Orbs, and these will scramble the prefixes on the item. On average, each 12 times that you attempt this, 8 times out of 12 you will get 1 prefix, 3 times out of 12 you'll get 2 prefixes, and 1 time in 12 you will get 3 prefixes. Now when you have 6 mods, you want to use Eldritch Chaos unless the item is already good. So when you've got 5 mods, if the item has good prefixes but does not have move speed, so let's say that it's got tier 1 life and something else you don't mind having, then what you want to do is benchcraft the 100% chill avoidance, 18 to 20% movement speed ring exclusive mod if you've unlocked that. If you haven't unlocked that, you can put one of the other movement speed mods instead. Alternately, you might get a real movement speed roll. So let's say you get 25% or better movement speed, and you also get some other mod on it that's not terrible. Then in this situation, you just benchcraft something. It's probably going to be life, maybe it'll be energy shield, whatever your character needs. Benchcraft that and use it as it is. You've got something that's functional. When you've got exactly 4 mods, you want to apply an Exalted Orb and then reassess, because now you're going to be in a 5 mod situation. On average, getting 25% or better movement speed is going to be about 1 in 6 Eldritch Chaos using this method, and you will need a fair number of Exalted Orbs as well. So instead of using 2 Divine Orbs like you used to, you'll now be using 6 Eldritch Chaos on average. And you'll have a slightly lower quality overall because you'll be accepting 25% movement speed, whereas previously with the Veiled Chaos meta mod approach, you would generally get better mods than 25% movement speed. That said, this is only slightly worse than the old method, and it's definitely something you should keep in mind if you're playing in Trade League. Solo self-found players, again, this one's not for you. Your third option, and this one's again quite Trade League biased but not exclusively, is to go fishing using Awakener Orbs. When I talk about fishing here, what I mean is that you're just setting up something that's easy to keep retrying. So every time that an Awakener Orb gives you a disappointing result, you just start over afresh and try again. Awakener Orbs have been off meta for a while, and so a lot of people may not know all of the nuances of them. But for those of you that do know the basics of Awakener Orbs, we're going to be using the non-elevated versions of some fairly premium mods. One popular combo is to go Tailwind and Elusive, but you can actually do better if you go 2 suffixes, and that's going to be the more budget approach. And we'll come back to 2 prefixes later as well, because there's a powerful craft that you can do with 2 prefixes that will work really well on certain builds, but that's going to be a much more expensive approach. So if you want to go for 2 suffixes, good examples here, you could go Hunter Tailwind, you could go Redeemer, effective non-damaging ailments you inflict, you could go Crusader Shock Avoidance, which is really good if you have the unique dual Storm Shroud. Then you can usually finish the item with Suffixes Cannot Change, followed by Reforged Speed. However, it's very important to note that if you do go for this approach, you definitely want your boots to be item level 86. The reason for this is you're probably going to want to roll over 10, 15, and 20% movement speed, and you'll be content with 25%, happy with 30 or 35%. Reforged Speed is going to cost you 2 divines each time you attempt it, as well as the cost of the Harvest Craft itself, because you're going to be using a meta mod each time you do it. And while it's guaranteed to give you a movement speed roll, it's not guaranteed to give you one of the tiers that you want. If there are 2 valid tiers that are good, so 25 and 35%, and 3 that are bad, then it's 40% to get a good tier, 60% to get a bad tier every time you throw 2 divines at the item. But if there are 3 tiers that are good, 25, 30, and 35%, and 3 tiers that are bad, then it's 50-50. So for this reason, it ends up being very, very worth paying the small extra in order to get an item level 86 starting point. Now this isn't an Awakener Orb tutorial, so we're not going to go into all the mechanics of making sure that your final item is item level 86, just to say that this is going to be a really important thing to do. Now you can optionally elevate these mods, and we'll come back to that later when we talk about one of the higher end crafts. It massively increases the cost and it only modestly improves the rewards. Is that worth it? That's going to be your choice, but I would generally advise that you start with a budget approach, then later on you make a new set of boots and try and sell your old ones. Now it's worth noting that Awakener Orbs, when they were meta, they used to be quite expensive, but they've fallen off meta and they've also had drop rate increases, and Cirrus Awakener of Worlds has had a bunch of additional loot added there. So a lot of people are running Cirrus hoping to get a massive Thread of Hope, hoping to get a specific Awakened Gem, or hoping to get the Oriath's End Unique Flask. And while they're doing that, they're generating Awakener Orbs with the higher drop rate that exists on the Uber version of the Cirrus encounter. For that reason, Awakener Orbs are probably going to be fairly cheap next league because there'll be that additional supply of them. So what your goal is here with the Awakener Orb fishing approach is that you just keep rolling the dice on these until you get boots that can easily be finished off with a bench craft. So maybe you get 30% movement speed naturally baked into the mod as a normal mod, then you benchcraft life and you use them as is. Or maybe you get tier 1 life and no movement speed roll at all. In that situation, then you just benchcraft on one of the best movement speed rolls and you're done. In solo self-found, this is obviously more limited, but it's not impossible because the drop rates for Awakener Orbs aren't that low, and Cirrus is something you can target farm to some extent. That said, you're going to need the ability to defeat Uber Cirrus if you want to do this, and most people are probably going to want to have boots that are reasonably good before they take on Uber Cirrus. So the main use case for this in solo self-found is if your first character is a dedicated bosser, and then later on you want to make boots for specific ults that you've got in mind, then in that case, that might be one of your best uses for all of the Awakener Orbs your first character might have made when they were trying to kill Uber Cirrus chasing Oriath's End or something else. Now your fourth option here is going to be the cheapest and definitely the most solo self-found friendly as well. And this is to make extensive use of Rog without using any Eldritch currency. Although you can use Eldritch currency to perfect the items later, it's just not going to be an integral part in getting prefixes and suffixes in a good state. Rog is extremely strong. Now Rog has a number of moods that you'll see that he gets into. One of them, he will try to fill up all of the mod slots on the item, and then once all of the mod slots are filled in either the prefixes or the suffixes, he'll start saying, hey, do you want to re-roll the prefixes on this item, but will bias towards higher level mods. Essentially with boots, higher level mods are almost always better. When Rog is in this particular mood, he will tend to give you 6 mod items that have 5 genuinely good mods on them, and there won't be complete cohesion between them. For example, you might get tier 1 movement speed, tier 1 life, tier 1 intelligence, tier 1 fire resistance, and then 2 completely undesired tier 1 mods like stun and block recovery. In this situation, you've got a genuinely good item, something you can happily use once you put Eldritch implicits onto it, and that doesn't require any RNG steps to go further with. Rog is extremely good once your character hits level 90 on boots, because once your character is level 90, at that point, he will gain the ability to sell you item level 86 items. At that point, the average movement speed roll you get will be better, and also your chance to get movement speed at all will considerably go up. Now I've mentioned Rog's moods here. It's my experience that Rog will pick a mood at random when you start a craft with him, and he has like 4 or 5 different ones. Sometimes, for instance, he'll offer to remove low tier mods from an item. He'll be in an Annul happy mood. Those ones tend not to give you very good boots. The ones that are good are when he keeps offering to exalt mods and upgrade their tiers, or when he says, let's re-roll all the suffixes X times and take the highest tiers. Those are the 2 moods you want to be in. If you get in one of those, then Rog has a good chance, certainly not guaranteed, but a good chance of giving you something good. What you want to do is use your scrap metals to look for item level 86 boots, especially ones that are not terrible bases, and then work on those. Also remember that you have the ability to skip crafts with Rog, but you can't skip 2 in a row. So if he gives you an option that looks like it's just treading water, like spending some currency in order to divine the item, or maybe divine it in a biased way, then in that situation, it's sometimes worth continuing, but you'll pick up your intuition as to whether it's worth continuing or starting over again as you get more experience with using Rog. In any case, Rog is the best way to do this in solo self-found and is quite compelling even in trade, especially because you can still apply Eldritch implicits later. Now let's talk about what happens though when Rog gives you a 6 mod item that is not good enough to wear yet, because it's missing movement speed. Here you've got 2 options, and here I'm assuming that you don't have access to Eldritch currency, because if you've got Eldritch Annuls, if you've got Eldritch Chaos, then they open up additional options as well. So if you get a 6 mod item in that situation, you can take an RNG Annul at it, which obviously has some chance of ruining the item. Then you can metamod the item with suffixes cannot be changed. Then you can apply an Orb of Scouring. Then you can benchcraft movement speed, and then you can double exalt the item. That's one option. Your other option is that you can apply an RNG Annul, and if you hit a prefix, then you can simply apply a benchcraft for movement speed. Another option is that you can say suffixes cannot change on the item, then you can use a Harvest Reforged Speed, which is guaranteed to give you a tier of movement speed, but not guaranteed to give you the one that you want. This has got about a 50% chance on an item level 86 plus item of giving you 25% or better movement speed, and it even has 1 chance in 6 of giving you the perfect 35%. So that's a really good option, and then of course you're up to the mercies of RNG as to whether you get good mods in the other slots, although you will usually have space to add at least a benchcrafted life mod if that's missing entirely from the item. Which of these is better is going to depend upon the state of the item after you fire your Annul off, and it's also going to depend upon the currency that you've got available to use. The first option is going to cost you 2 Exalts and 2 Divines once you get lucky and the item survives the Annul. As well as that, you're going to need to have an Annul before you can even attempt this at all. The second option still needs the rarest part of this craft, which is the Annulment Orb. Remember that Orbs of Annulment are 2.5 times as rare as Divine Orbs or Exalted Orbs as generic monster drops and also from Eldritch Altars, but they are also something that you can target farm. So do keep that one in mind. Also, don't try and target farm the Divination cards for Orbs of Annulment. They are very, very rare. I think out of these three options, my favourite is the one where you lock suffixes and then use Harvest Reforged Speed, but it is going to depend upon the specific item that you've got, and also upon your access to various specific types of currency. Now let's start with option 5, and this is an SSF or Trade League option that's going to involve starting with luck. Now this luck can be yours, or if you're playing in the Trade League, it can be someone else's luck. Here we're going to start with a lucky fracture, and then we're going to craft from there. 25%, 30% and 35% fractured movement speed boots are a great starting point. 35% movement speed fractured boots can drop in a few places. For example, in Labyrinth Trials in Tier 16 maps, in Abyssal Depths in Tier 16 maps, and also anywhere in a Veldo map. The monsters are monster levels 84, and so the rare monsters drop I-86 loot. There's a few of these places, but most of the time you're not going to find I-86 fractured items very often. But 25% and 30% are good enough. If you get these, I generally prefer fossils for further crafting because prismatic fossils will get you a lot of resists, and generally speaking the boots are a fairly weak spot for other mods, but the resists are full power on them. So that's something you can consider, but your character's needs will differ. It's about 2.5% of fractured boot drops that will have 25% or 30% movement speed as a locked mod. Now 2.5% is not a high percentage chance, but you do get a large amount of fractured boots dropping, so if you add them onto your loot filter, you will be able to find them, and there's other fractured mods you can work with as well. For instance, I'd happily have 47% fire resistance as a fracture. That's something you could start with. You could start with 33% chaos resist. You could start with 12% suppression. All of these would be good starting points. Now, if your fractured boots are item level 85 or lower and don't have locked movement speed, then Essences of Zeal, specifically Shrieking Essences of Zeal, which is the second highest tier, these are worthwhile considering. They will guarantee that you get 30% movement speed as a mod on the item. Deafening ones are better, but not by a lot, and it may be better just to make 3 times as many attempts at 30% movement speed than to make 1/3 as many attempts at 32% movement speed, but then run out of essences because the other mods that are available with them end up being disappointing. Now, another option that can come up if you get item level 86 fractured boots, and those item level 86 fractured boots have a pretty desirable fractured mod on them. For example, let's say you got 53 dexterity on them and you need dexterity on your character, or maybe you've got 47 fire resistance. In that situation, what you can do is you can use Harvest Reforged Speed. This is an alternative to using the essences, and essentially they've got their own strengths and weaknesses. Harvest Reforged Speed will always give you a speed mod, i.e. movement speed, but you'll have no control over which tier you get. If the item level is 86 though, it's 50% to be 25, 30 or 35. If the item level is 85, then it's only 40% to be 25 or 30, because 35 is not a valid roll. So that's a few options that you've got that you can tailor to the specific above average fractured items that you happen to loot. Finally, we've got the high-end Awakener Orb version. I just want to quickly go through this because this is something you could do in patch 3.23 as well, and it's going to be very similar. I just want to go through this because it's something that the new Veiled Orb will come in really handy on. So this is a more expensive option, and it starts for builds that want 2 specific high-end classic influence prefixes. And here we're going to be doing Awakener Orb stuff again. This time our starting point is going to be Elevated Hunters pierce 3 to 5 targets boots, and the Elevated Redeemers elusive on crits plus increased effective elusive on you boots. Get these 2, merge them together using an Awakener Orb, and then 40% of the time you'll have 2 prefixes, 60% of the time you'll have 3. Those numbers are a little bit approximate. I'm not going to guarantee they're exactly right, but they should be pretty close. Now, if you've got 3 prefixes at this point, you have an RNG Annul step, and that's going to be unfortunate because you've got a 2/3 chance of ruining the item. All told though, between the Awakener Orb and the potential to annul, you've got about a 40% chance to ruin the item and have to start over, and about a 60% chance to push on to the next step. Once you get there, you've now got 2 prefixes on the item, and they're both elevated. If you've got 3 suffixes at this point, this is not desired, and you're going to need to go for another RNG Annul, but this is not a likely situation to be in. All told, you're about 50% to survive all the RNG to get to this point. At this point, all you want to do is then benchcraft prefixes can't change, and then apply a Veiled Orb to the item. This is almost certain to give you one of the veiled versions of movement speed, which is where you want to be at this point. Now that you've done this, You're then going to clean up the rest of your mods using meta mods. There's a few ways you can do this. You can go can't change prefixes, apply an Orb of Scouring, which will leave the 3 prefixes intact and then allow you to exalt the item twice and then reassess whether you need to repeat this step. Or alternatively, you can benchcraft prefixes can't change, and then you can go for a harvest, reforge an item with an influence mod, if that's something that suits your character better. There's a small chance of ruin if you go with the reforge influence approach, and it is a very expensive craft, so you'll have to tailor that to your own build. Anyway, those are some ways that you can deal with the removal of Veiled Chaos Orbs in the single slot that they were the most important in. I'm going to leave it there. May your Veil Orbs have interesting results.